遥かな西、海の向こうにヴィンランドという名の土地がある。そこは暖かく豊かで、奴隷商人も戦の炎も届かぬ遠い地だ。どうだ、いつか俺たちと一緒にその地で暮らさないか。
You have no enemies. A statement that seems rather impossible when you first hear it. Of course we have enemies. Just look throughout history. History is full with nations making enemies with other nations and solving this conflict only through means of war and violence. Or even if you look smaller, we individually have enemies. And whether it's a school bully, an ex that hurts you, or even an annoying coworker that just won't shut up, making enemies is inherent to human nature. But what if I told you this wasn't the case? What if I told you that you in fact don't have enemies? Famous French poet says, "All wars are civil wars because men are brothers." And I don't think these words are portrayed any better than Makoto Yokimura's Vinland Saga. You have no enemies. These were the words spoken by the late and great Thors, aka the Troll of Joms. But in order to understand a sentence of this magnitude, we must first understand the world in which Vinland Saga exists in, and we do this by looking at the character Thorkel, who I believe perfectly embodies the Viking world. Thorkel the Tall served as our main antagonistic force throughout most of the series, and I think he perfectly represents what a Viking ought to be. Thors was a Joms Viking, along with Thors back in the day, and he was this big, brute, larger than life type of figure where every time he stepped on a battlefield his presence had to be recognized. And Thorkel's greatness as a Viking doesn't just end at his physical attributes. Thorkel is quite literally the strongest Viking alive, and this is shown by every time we see him in battle, he's always doing some outstanding feat, like hauling massive boulders and logs, killing multiple people at the same time, dual wielding axes, and single-handedly keeping an English defense force that was quite frankly losing the war still staying in the game by just his presence alone. And he loves it all. He loves war, he loves violence, he loves fighting, he loves conflict, and a lot of times in the shows he will purposely put himself into situations where there's more violence in the outcome. This entire Viking world idolizes the essence of being at war, idolizes the atmosphere of conflict, idolizing having enemies and defeating them honorably in a battle, and idolizing defending your honor to one day earn a spot in Valhalla. And Thorkel is everything about this Viking world embodied into one large, bigger than life giant. But if you are Thorkel the Tall, what do you have left? What do you have left when you seemingly accomplished everything you could have in this Viking world? What is there to do now? Thorkel can provide us with an answer. Towards the end of the season, in his second rendezvous with Thorfinn, when he's explaining how his father, Thors, came to lead the Joms Vikings, Thorkel adds that with his disappearance, it made him realize that what happens to a Viking when he's alive or even long after he's dead doesn't really matter, and the true thing that matters to a warrior is where his soul is. And he adds that his one regret in life is that he never followed Thors to go find Vinland, because Thor's soul is somewhere he'll never be able to reach, and that place where he won't be able to reach is where he believes Thors became a true warrior. And this brings us to our next stop. Further examining this Viking world and exposing it for what it truly is, peeling back the thin layers of honor and fighting for Valhalla, we really see that this Viking world truly is just a gruesome one. All these Vikings are meant to do is cause senseless violence, murder, ravage villages, assault women, and all for the name of being a good warrior. And this is where our three main characters come in. Our three characters, Thorfinn, Askeladd, and Prince Canute, all experienced this Viking world from an outside point of view. Thorfinn spent most of his youth growing up underneath the love and care of his father and mother in Iceland. Prince Canute spent his time growing up in a big, pretty castle away from the horrors of war. And Askeladd, well, was just a poor Welsh boy without a father, looking to take care of his mom by any means necessary. And it is because our three main characters are outside of this Viking world, we're able to sit back and look from a neutral standpoint what is truly going on. It is through Thorfinn seeing his father get murdered right in front of him in such a honorless and tasteless way is when him, along with the viewer, realizes that the Viking world can be cruel and is full of people without honor, and honestly, people use this veil of honor and respect to just kill mercilessly. Thor's never stood a chance against Askeladd's army, because at the end of the day, they came there for one thing and one thing only, to take Thor's head, and they would do anything they could in order to meet that end. There's this unspoken rule amongst Vikings in Vinland Saga, is that what happens on the battlefield stays on the battlefield. Is when the battle is all said and done, it doesn't matter if I killed your father, it doesn't matter if I killed your brother, it doesn't matter if I pillaged your town, it's all just water under the bridge at this point. With Thorfinn being outside of this Viking world, it allows him, along with us, to challenge this notion of water underneath the bridge, challenge this notion of all is said and forgotten once the war is over, because at the end of the day, a father just got taken from his child, and that is not fair. But only Thorfinn, along with the viewer, are able to recognize this, because we are not a part of this Viking world, which means we do not succumb to the ideals and morals that fulfill this Vinland Saga universe. We're able to step back and look back from a neutral point of view and see the true horrors of what just happened to Thor's. When we take a look at Askeladd, we realize that his mother was a slave and his father being a Danish Viking, and we realize that his existence itself is a direct example and a direct outcome of this Viking world. And with Askeladd living in a world where Vikings abuse the power that they have, and they take over poor countries and pillage and assault and impregnate women without a second thought, him being from Wales, a prime source of slaves for Vikings, he becomes direct collateral of this Viking chaos. And this horrible feeling reaches its climax when Askeladd almost sees his mother get killed by the hands of his own father, who can't even recognize her. And it is then that Askeladd realizes that Artorius is never coming. Artorius is never coming back to save a world where Vikings fulfilled their lustful desires for sex and women through means of having slaves and impregnating multiple women. No one is coming to save Askeladd, and nobody ever will. And finally, we have Prince Canute, a young prince who grew up, for the most part, a pacifist his whole life. And with him being of royal blood, he was fortunate enough to not know the horrors and the true gruesomeness of this Viking world, and that is until he is sent off to war by his father, and is accompanied by Askeladd's mercenary group. This all comes into fruition for Canute in episode 14 of Vinland Saga, which is quite frankly one of the hardest episodes to watch in the entire series. This episode follows a family, just a run-of-the-mill, loving dad, loving mom, and just enthusiastic kids. And with the snowstorm coming up and a harsh winter on the way, Askeladd's mercenary group invades this village and pillages them and robs them for all of their food. And after taking all of their food, Askeladd rounds up everybody in the village and begins to execute them, all 60 of them. And seeing this from Canute's point of view, we realize that these Vikings are truly evil and only care about themselves, and murder is something that just is a byproduct of what happens when you're in war. And with that, you have our three main characters experiencing this Viking world from an outside point of view, and when essentially forced into this environment, it creates a deep change within all of them. Canute makes the decision to turn away from God. Thorfinn is fueled by hate and revenge, and Askeladd is fueled by the need to protect Wales by any means necessary. And being forced to change like this, it turns you into something else. It turns you into a slave. In this scene where Thorfinn meets the slave on the ship, and then she then goes on to point out that her and Thorfinn are one and the same, is truly a powerful moment in the show, and quite honestly, it speaks to the grander narratives this story is trying to tell. Thorfinn pities the existence of this slave, as he doesn't quite understand how somebody can be bound to another human without feeling this overwhelming sense of the need to be free from the shackles that hold you down. And the true irony of this scene is that Thorfinn doesn't realize that he himself is a slave too, along with everybody in this Vinland Saga universe. Thorfinn, along with Askeladd, are slaves to their own hate, as they both had traumatic things happen to them in the past, and the hate from that event caused them to throw their entire life away, changing the entire course of their existence. Prince Canute becomes a slave to God, as he feels rejected by him. Now he is driving to establish a world that is way more holy and way more peaceful than God could ever have imagined. And even King Sweyn is a slave to his crown, as he wanted to do all these moral and just things, but when the power is in his hands, it corrupted his soul, and he is now being guided by the will of the crown. And this metaphor can be extended to everybody in the Vinland Saga universe, as everybody is fueled by and thus a slave to greed, money, women, sex, and power. And the worst part about all of this is that these things people are enslaved to become such a crucial part of their identity, they fail to imagine what life would be like without them. What is Thorfinn without his hate for Askeladd? And what is Askeladd without his hate for Danes? And what is Prince Canute without his hate for God? And even the slave on the ship says it herself, is that even if she were to break free of her shackles and to cross the ocean, she wouldn't even know where to go. But this slave seems to be the only person to recognize that she is actually a slave to something. So ironically, this slave on the ship becomes the freest person in the world. But what does this all mean? Now that you realize how cruel and evil this Viking world is, and how being a part of it changes you fundamentally, essentially making you a slave, you start to remove yourself from these character situations, and begin to assess what's truly going on here. Because what are enemies? Are they not just people you fight who live in another region? A region that is under the control of a king that only answers to its own lust for power, and power that will soon be overtaken by greater powers in the future, and thus continuing the cycle? You realize that this violence you see in this Viking world isn't indicative of the moral failing of these individual Vikings, but it speaks to how it is a result of a grander narrative of power struggles, a power struggle that will never end, and most importantly, a power struggle that serves no purpose. These Vikings are only fighting to serve the interests of an imperialist world, a world that would be perfectly fine without senseless violence and murder. You then realize that these Vikings are just a cog in the machine of something much bigger than themselves. And once you remove these Vikings from this machine and take a closer look into their hearts, you'll find that at the end of the day, you have no enemies, because all men want is peace. Thank you for watching.